road stretched endlessly in front of me, darkness pressing in on all sides. It had been a long drive, and the last gas station I'd passed felt like a mirage. When the glowing vacancy sign of a roadside motel appeared in the distance, I almost sighed with relief. I didn't care how shabby it was, I just needed a bed for the night. The receptionist barely looked up from his newspaper as I walked in. "Room 12, he said, sliding a key across the counter. His indifference was almost comforting, just another part of the motel's charm, I told myself. These places were always a little rough around the edges. Nothing to get worked up about. The room wasn't much to look at. Old carpet, a bed with a sagging mattress, and a faint smell of bleach mixed with damp. I tossed my bag on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to ignore how the springs creaked under my weight. The bathroom light flickered when I turned it on, but it worked. I splashed some water on my face and decided to call it a night. As I settled into the bed, something on the wall caught my eye, a dark smudge near the baseboard just above the carpet. I leaned closer. It wasn't much, just a small brownish stain. Could have been coffee. Could have been anything, really. I shrugged it off, climbed under the blanket, and closed my eyes. I woke up to a dull thud. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I told myself it was probably the room next door. Thin walls, noisy guests, nothing to worry about. Still, I felt uneasy, like the air in the room had shifted. As I sat up, I noticed something new, a faint metallic smell. It wasn't strong, just enough to make me wrinkle my nose. Maybe the air conditioner needed cleaning. I got up to investigate and nearly tripped over my bag. When I bent down to move it, I noticed something on the chair where I'd tossed it earlier. A dark smudge on the fabric. I touched it lightly with my fingertips. It was sticky. I frowned, wiping my hand on my pants. Maybe I hadn't noticed it before. Maybe it was nothing, but the smell lingered, sharp and cloying. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. Sleep deprivation could do strange things to your mind. The night stretched on, my sleep broken by restless tossing and turning. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about that stain on the chair, that faint smell in the air. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but when I woke up again, this time to a soft creak from the floorboards, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The door was locked. The window was shut. But as the beam of light swept over the carpet, I noticed something else. A small, dark trail leading from the door to the bed. It was subtle, almost invisible in the dim light, but it was there. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I told myself it was just dirt, mud from someone's shoes, nothing more. But my gut told me otherwise. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what to do. Leave? Call the front desk? But for what? A stain on the carpet? A strange smell? They'd think I was crazy. Still, the feeling of wrongness was impossible to ignore. I couldn't shake the image of that trail, leading right to where I was sitting. And then, almost without thinking, I looked under the bed. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was dark, and my flashlight wasn't bright enough to reach every corner. But then the beam landed on something, a piece of fabric, crumpled and stained. My heart started pounding as I realized it was a shirt. I reached out to pull it closer, my hands shaking when I saw the hand. It was sticking out from the far side of the bed, pale and still. A hand, curled slightly as if frozen mid-motion. I stumbled back, hitting my head on the desk behind me, and scrambled to my feet. My chest tightened as the pieces clicked into place. The stains, the smell, the trail on the carpet. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, barely remembering to grab my phone on the way out. I called the police from my car, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd found. The dispatcher told me to stay put, but there was no way I was going back inside. I locked myself in the car, parked under a street lamp, and waited for the flashing lights to appear. The officers arrived about 15 minutes later. They went inside while I stayed outside, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. One of them came back out to speak to me, his face grim. "You were right to call," he said. That was all he said, but I didn't need details. I already knew. I drove away that night, parking at a rest stop miles away. I didn't sleep much, my mind replaying the image of that pale, lifeless hand and the trail that had led me straight to it. I still don't know the full story of what happened in that room, but I don't think I want to. All I know is that I'll never ignore my instincts again. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just long enough to sleep before continuing on to my sister's place. I'd left late and driven through 3 states before finally pulling off the highway and spotting a squat, faded motel with a rooms at $29,999 sign. It wasn't promising, but I didn't have the energy to care. The woman at the front desk was old, with deep-set wrinkles and a cigarette dangling from her lips. She didn't ask for much, just my ID and cash. "Room 8, she rasped, sliding the key across the counter. Her yellowed fingers lingered on it. "Don't lock yourself out. There's no one on duty after midnight." I nodded, grabbed the key, and walked out into the humid night. Room 8 was the last in the row, its door barely clinging to a chipped coat of green paint. When I stepped inside, the air was thick and stale, the faint scent of bleach not quite masking something. Earthy. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here for luxury. I was here for sleep. The first thing I noticed was the window. It was cracked open just an inch. Not enough to be alarming, but enough to feel strange. I shut it quickly and locked it, pulling the thin curtains closed. The bed was sagging in the middle, but it didn't matter. I kicked off my shoes, climbed under the scratchy blanket, and let exhaustion take over. I woke up an hour later to the sound of something scraping against the floor. It was faint, just a soft dragging noise, like fabric being pulled. My first thought was that it must have been coming from the room next door. Thin walls, I told myself. I turned over and tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard it again, closer. This time my eyes shot open, and I lay there, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. The noise came again, a faint scrape, now unmistakably from inside the room. My pulse started to race as I scanned the dim space, lit only by the faint orange glow of the parking lot seeping through the curtains. I didn't see anything at first. The chair by the small desk looked untouched. The door was still locked. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed it. The corner of the blanket hanging off the bed was moving, not swaying, not shifting from air circulation. It was being pulled. I froze, every muscle locking up. The blanket shifted again, and this time I felt it tug at my foot. My instinct screamed at me to get up, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Instead, I jerked the blanket back hard and leapt out of bed, flipping on the overhead light. Nothing. Just an empty room. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Sleep deprivation. Stress. Maybe I'd kicked the blanket off myself. But then I noticed the closet door. It was open just a crack, even though I was sure it had been shut when I came in. I told myself not to check, to grab my bag, my keys, and leave. But curiosity, or stupidity, got the better of me. I picked up the lamp from the desk, holding it like a weapon, and crept toward the closet. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle and yanked it open. Empty. Just a few wire hangers and a smell like damp wood. I let out a shaky laugh, relieved but embarrassed at how jumpy I was. Still, I didn't feel right staying. I decided to pack up and sleep in my car if I had to. That's when I saw it. The curtain by the window was shifting, slowly, subtly, like someone was standing behind it, barely brushing the fabric. My stomach dropped. I hadn't opened the window since I arrived. I grabbed my bag, threw it over my shoulder, and bolted for the door. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I yanked the door open, ran to my car, and slammed the door shut. I didn't even turn off the headlights as I peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying under my tires. I drove for miles before I finally pulled over at a rest stop, hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. My brain replayed the moment over and over, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had snuck in while I was asleep. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. The key to room 8 was sitting in the passenger seat. I didn't remember grabbing it, and the last thing I'd seen before leaving the room, the closet door swinging slowly shut. I pulled into the motel parking lot just after midnight, exhausted from 10 hours of driving. It was one of those roadside motels, small, cheap, and probably never full. The neon sign blinked vacancy like it was a warning instead of an invitation. I didn't plan to stay long, just enough sleep to make the next leg of the trip bearable. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with greasy hair and glasses that seemed too big for his face, barely looked up as I walked in. "Room for one?" he asked monotone. "Yeah, just for the night." He handed me the key to room 12 without another word, his eyes flicking toward the dark hallway as if he expected someone to emerge from the shadows. I didn't think much of it at the time. Just another guy stuck in a dead-end job. The room was as basic as they come. Dingy carpet, flickering overhead light, and a smell that landed somewhere between mildew and cigarette smoke. I locked the door and set the chain, out of habit more than fear. After a quick shower, I threw myself on the stiff bed, determined to pass out. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. A soft click, 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 like fingernails tapping on glass. I froze, listening, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from the window. I wanted to ignore it, rationalize it as tree branches or wind, but the curiosity was stronger than my fear. I crept to the window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. Nothing. The parking lot was empty except for my car. Just an eerie orange glow from the buzzing streetlights. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and stepped back. That's when I heard it again. Click, click, click. But this time it came from the door. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed the nearest weapon-like object I could find, a cheap lamp from the bedside table, and approached the door as quietly as I could. Through the peephole I saw nothing, just the same dimly lit hallway. But I knew what I'd heard. I decided not to open the door. Instead, I turned off the lights in the room, figuring it might make me less of a target, and sat on the bed, lamp in hand, waiting, listening. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside my door. They paused for a moment, then continued down the hallway. I debated whether to call the front desk, but something told me not to. The receptionist's odd behavior earlier suddenly felt relevant. Instead, I grabbed my phone and Googled the motel, hoping for reviews or any kind of information. What I found made my stomach drop. The first few results were the usual complaints: bad service, dirty rooms. But then I saw a post from a local news site, dated a few months back. A man had been arrested at this very motel for targeting lone travelers. He would stalk them, figure out which room they were in, and wait until they fell asleep. Then he'd break in. I was halfway through the article when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Room 12? I nearly dropped the phone. How the hell did someone get my number? I hadn't even used it at the front desk. My breathing grew shallow as I stared at the screen. The message came in again. You still awake? I turned off the phone and stuffed it under the pillow, willing myself to think. To act. The car keys were in my bag, but that meant walking through the hallway. Whoever this was, they knew I was here. I wasn't sure if I'd make it to the parking lot before they caught up. Then I remembered the chain lock. It wasn't much, but it was something. I grabbed the chair from the desk and wedged it under the doorknob for extra security. Not perfect, but better than nothing. I waited in silence for what felt like an eternity. No footsteps, no sounds. Maybe whoever it was had moved on. Then the doorknob turned. The chain rattled violently as whoever was on the other side shoved at the door. My makeshift barricade held for now, but the sound was relentless, pounding, scraping, the groan of the wood as it strained against the force. I grabbed my phone, turned it back on, and dialed 911 with shaking hands. Someone's trying to break into my room, I whispered to the dispatcher. I gave her the motel name and room number as the pounding continued. Stay on the line, she said. Officers are on their way. The banging stopped suddenly, replaced by silence. A silence so complete it was deafening. I stayed frozen in place, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. Not even footsteps retreating down the hall. I didn't dare open the door until I heard the sirens. The police arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. When they broke into the room next to mine, they found it empty except for a few cigarette butts and a knife left on the nightstand. They said there were signs someone had been staying there recently, but no one knew who. The receptionist was gone when they searched the office, leaving the motel eerily abandoned. I didn't wait for answers. I checked out immediately and drove straight through the night, stopping only when I saw the sunrise and a diner full of people. That was 2 years ago. I still don't know who was behind that door, or how they got my number, but I don't stay in roadside motels anymore.